All right, everybody, how's it going? Welcome to another edition of Tony Talks. This episode, I had on the program Doctor Gurpreet Padda, or as he's going to be known on Tony Talks from now on, Dr. G. Yeah, Dr. G Money, because that's what this podcast was. It was money. Not only was it money, it was health, because I learned more talking to this guy than I ever learned in anything that anybody that I ever spoke to in the past about nutrition, about dieting, about lifestyle, about all that good essential shit that we need to take care of our bodies. And it was very informative. I know if you do listen to this to the end, you're just going to get more and more stuff out of it because it was mind blowing. And make sure you check out his materials, reversediabetesmd.com, as well as his Instagram page, which is Reverse Diabetes MD. And he says he responds to everybody. He helps a lot of people. I spoke to him for a little bit after the podcast. He was able to give me some bits of wisdom and things that I should do for my own personal health. So I'm sure he'll be more than willing to help out anybody that reaches out to him. So that's all I'm going to say for now, because I really want you to get right into it, delve into it. And remember, Tony Talks 8 on both Twitter and Instagram. Tony Talks 8 podcast at gmail.com and Tony Talks 8 podcast.com to get to the website. Give it a listen. I'm going to put the sources up from this podcast onto the website as well. So if there's anything that you have questions about, check it out. Make sure you check out his materials as well. Okay, here comes the intro, and take it away. The legendary Dr. G.
Yeah, I started my career as somebody that went into surgery first. I went to Cook County, Chicago, and my goal was to become a trauma surgeon. And I got quickly bored because mechanically it was a lot of fun, but intellectually it wasn't exactly what I was looking for. I liked biochemistry, I liked neurochemistry, and I loved the mechanical aspect of surgery and trauma, but I found that there weren't enough puzzles for me to solve. And so I went into anesthesia, which was fascinating because that was all the puzzles and some of the procedures, but then that wasn't quite what I was looking for. So then I went pediatric anesthesia, thinking that complexity would be more interesting and it would give me a bigger adrenaline rush. And it did for many years. And then from there, I started doing pediatric pain and then started doing adult pain. And from adult pain, I jumped into understanding addiction and obesity. And so it's been a circuitous route. It wasn't straightforward.
You said adrenaline rush.
Yeah.
So you were looking for something that could, not so routine, but would have to cause you to form like complex, figure out problems, I guess.
Yeah, what I do all day long is figure out solutions to things that other people haven't been able to figure out. So I like looking at puzzles and saying, I wonder what's causing this, and then using all of my biochemistry, pharmacology, mechanical, and experiential background, and then coming up with a solution based upon the models that I have in my head, and then testing those models. And so you can do that in real time with patients when you're trying to figure out why they haven't managed to lose weight. For example, the statistic is that if you follow the standard protocol for weight loss, which is move more and eat less, your chances of losing weight is 1 in 167. That's a less than 1% chance that you're actually going to maintain weight loss over a year. And so that's why the vast majority of patients try to lose weight and they don't get anywhere, which is a whole different world. My patients have a statistical rate that's a little bit over 80%. And I'm looking at these patients 5, 7, 10 years later, and they're still managing to maintain weight loss. And so our fundamental understanding of what obesity is in the United States is flawed. And when you understand the fundamental flaw, then you can help these patients.
You said move more, eat less, but what is that another way of saying caloric deficit?
Yeah, what we try to do is we try to create a caloric deficit, and caloric deficit certainly will make you lose weight, but is that the solution long term? Is a calorie deficit something that will make you lose weight? Because a calorie is not a calorie. So a calorie of one
Okay.
type of food is totally different than a calorie of a different kind of food. It's not the calorie that counts, it's what the body does with the calorie. And you have to realize that food is information for your body. And it has peptides in it, it has all kinds of other interesting compounds, it communicates with your body. And so a calorie of fat, which might be nutrient dense, 9 kilocalories per gram,
Hmm.
which has more calories than the same weight of carbohydrate, has a totally different reaction, and it may not make you gain weight. It may actually make you lose weight. It depends on the information contained within the calorie, and that's a fundamental flaw. That's one of the fundamental flaws that we have in westernized society. A calorie is not a calorie. A calorie is information. What you do with the information determines how your body responds and where you are.
Okay, so because you hear people say it's a good thing to carb load before you have like a workout, or at least have some carbs before you go on a run or you do anything that's going to require you to burn energy, because the way it's stored is it's going to be burnt out quicker, right? It's going to be the first thing that the body goes to.
So I acknowledge that the first thing the body goes to is the circulating glucose in your bloodstream. The next place the body goes to is the glycogen reserve in your liver and in your muscle. And once it exceeds the 500 grams of average glycogen reserve, which works out to about 2,000 calories for the average human, 2,400 or whatever it is, then it dips into pulling calories from fat. And then the last thing to go is structural protein. Our problem is that, and the other thing you have to realize is you're circulating grams of glucose in your bloodstream is probably about maybe, you know, 3/4 of a teaspoon, maybe a teaspoon and a half. It's not much. And
So you
so
said 3/4 of
of a
the
teaspoon,
is
teaspoon,
how much?
that's how much glucose you have in your bloodstream at any given time. But if you drink a Coke, you just had 13 to 15 teaspoons of sugar. And so you just overwhelmed your system with way more sugar than what you had circulating. And so you have to look at this from a model perspective. So you have a very small amount of circulating glucose, very, very tiny, and it's tightly regulated. Why is it tightly regulated? You have to ask yourself. Because it's very, very toxic to the human body. We do everything we can to maintain low glucose levels, because when you increase glucose levels, it causes something called glycation. Glycation is like oxidation, it's like rust. And so if you start glycating all your protein, you start glycating your DNA, and you start glycating your lipids, they stop working. It's the same thing as if you took mechanical parts in a car and you poured sugar in the engine, it would all get sticky and would gum up and it would die. That's the same thing with sugar in your body. So you're very tightly regulated. You don't need much circulating sugar. Your body wants to get rid of it as fast as possible. It needs a very, very small amount for some basic functions, but a tiny amount.
It's a great
People,
analogy with
yeah,
the sugar in
yeah.
the car.
And then the second part of it is once it starts to burn through just a little bit of it, it starts taking your glycogen reserve, which is basically cross-linked glucose molecules with water that's stored in your liver and your fat, and it starts pulling those out, and it starts converting those into circulating glucose and allows you to utilize those. As you start to deplete those, then it allows you to get into your fat, and the fat is
All
converted into
right.
ketones, and the ketones then circulate, and that's your alternative fuel form. And so your actual requirement, your essential requirement for glucose consumption in the average human is 0. You don't actually need any glucose at all to be a hominid. To be a human, we don't have a requirement for glucose. We get plenty from ketone functions, and we get plenty from gluconeogenesis through our liver. So we don't need to consume external glucose. We do need to consume external proteins because we have essential amino acids, and we do need to consume essential fatty acids that we can't manufacture. But we can manufacture all the carbohydrate we need. And the average American eats about 200 grams plus of carbohydrate, but we need 0.
That's probably like conservative.
Yeah, it's over. But I'm just saying it's over 200. The standard American diet, I think I actually looked at it, was like 462 or something. But it's over 200, and we don't need any.
We don't need any.
No,
so we don't
0.
Need...
And so this concept of carb loading, so let's go back to that.
Right.
So the carb loading concept is an amazing concept, not prior to your workout. I look at carbohydrates as performance enhancing. They're performance enhancing drugs. And so if you are running a long distance and you are truly glycogen depleted and you are not fat adapted, then you will gain some benefit by consuming glucose along the way.
That's like those little goo packets.
Yeah, you might gain some benefit. I wouldn't recommend it because I recommend everybody become fat adapted. And that way you've got an unlimited reserve
of ketone.
Yeah, you've got an unlimited reserve of ketones. And it's until you become fat adapted that you feel like shit if you don't, if you're not fat adapted, if you're not ketogenic.
I did and I don't know how to the T I was, but I kept track of the macros as best as I can. And I did it for about 6 to 8 months. And when I got blood work done, my cholesterol levels went to like 297.
Okay.
Is that and I didn't have like a primary care physician. This is just me bro sciencing it. Could that be dangerous, or you got to look at the ratio? Or yeah, and I'm 155 pounds, work out every day, and
yeah. So an LDL-C, which is typically what's measured, of 297, could be okay. It could be healthy. It could be unhealthy. What we do know is an LDL-C really has no bearing on morbidity or mortality. And in fact, a low LDL-C in your 50s and 60s and 70s increases your risk of stroke. And we know that it increases your risk of sarcopenia. We know it increases your risk of low testosterone. And so an LDL-C doesn't mean much. Now, if you told me your LDL-C was 2000, I'd say, hey, that's a problem and we should look at that. But an LDL-C of 290, I don't get worked up about it. I look at the isomers below that, and I really look at LDL-P, which is small particle count LDL. You have to, I take the analogy, and I was, when I teach my patients, how should you look at it? Because I get the same questions. Well, Dr. Padda, my LDL-C is a little bit high, and I got put on statins. Do I need the statins? Or can I get off the statins because I'm having muscle pain? Or do the statins increase a risk for me? And so the correct answer...
I'm sorry, the statins...
increase the risk of diabetes.
Statins increase risk of diabetes.
Yeah, there's a strong correlation between statin usage and diabetes. There's a strong correlation between hypogonadism, low testosterone, and statin usage. Because what they do is they're indiscriminate, and they drop your cholesterol, and they drop all of your hormone formation at the same time. And
this is, I'm just to clarify, this is something that would be prescribed to somebody that has high cholesterol levels.
Yeah, that's the classic. The classic. So what you're supposed to do if somebody has high cholesterol is you're supposed to have dietary change. You're supposed to change their lifestyle.
Mm-hmm, of course.
But what happens is most physicians won't spend the 3 extra minutes it takes to get a lifestyle change because most physicians are misinformed.
Magic pill.
Yeah, well, there's a Credit Suisse study from the, I think Credit Suisse, which is a insurance group out of Zurich. They did a beautiful study, and they looked at misinformation in physicians, and they found that over 90% of physicians thought that eating fat increased cholesterol level, and that's misinformed. That we've disproven that over 10 years ago. The cholesterol that we measure is not the fat that you eat. The cholesterol we measure is the result of an inflammatory cascade, and that's really more correlated with excessive carbohydrate consumption. And certainly you will get a small rise in LDL-C if you eat a ton of fat because you're not clearing it, but that's not necessarily a bad thing.
That's more than likely what would happen in a case with mine when I was having like 50 grams of carbs a day, probably, or something like that.
And so if you maintain some carb consumption, you'll still have an inflammatory cascade. So most of my patients are on less than 20 grams of carbs per day. Most of them are as low as they can be because I have to get them there to get their diabetes reversed. And then we can re-add carbohydrate, but we don't re-add high glycemic index. We don't re-add processed carbohydrate. We add back natural carbohydrates, things like in starchy food that's hard to digest. Because that glycemic index is what we want to maintain low.
Would that be like whole grains?
So the majority of my patients have pain, so I stay away from most of the grains because a lot of them have intolerance to gluten and gliadin. And so we typically will re-add vegetable biomass. We will re-add things like potatoes that have been cooked and then cooled. Because if you cook a potato and you eat it, its glycemic index is high. But if you cook a potato and then you cool it and then eat it, the glycemic index is low because it changes the crystallization of the sugar.
Wait, so you have to cook it and then let it cool?
Yeah, you let it cool before you eat it. So there's some subtleties there. Yeah, there's some subtlety there. And if you do that, your absorption of carbohydrate is practically nil because it's a difficult to digest starch.
Everybody's going to realize how stupid I am when they listen to this podcast because I'm just going to keep asking these questions over and over. But let me ask you, you said reversing diabetes. So, and this is, and I know I got a good buddy, listen to him as soon as this is done. My dad too have type 2 diabetes. I understand, I think let's just make the clarification, type 1 is completely different, right? There's no, because you're born with that.
Well, type 1 is a lack of insulin production.
Naturally
so
in your body, right?
Yeah, your body doesn't make type 1 or your body doesn't make insulin. And so that was the original origin of insulin manufacturing. We had diabetics that were dying. A group of Canadian Nobel laureates manufactured purified insulin and gave it to the insulin companies to forever give it away at no cost. And that was the deal. These two Canadians who won the Nobel Prize came up with insulin extracted and purified and gave it to the insulin companies, who promptly agreed that they would forever provide insulin at no cost. But then they promptly turned around, manipulated it slightly, adding a little zinc, adding a little prolamine and a few other drugs to it, and then they started making a shitload of money on it. And so it was originally supposed to be free because they were donating it, but the insulin companies manipulated it slightly, and then they remanufactured it and genetically modified it to make it pure. And now the average cost of insulin per diabetic patient is between $850 to $1,300 a month. It's a great residual revenue stream. And it was originally designed for type 1 diabetics. And at that point in our history, in the US and Canadian history, a good chunk of our patients were type 1 diabetic. Type 1 diabetes now represents less than 3% to maybe 5% of all diabetes. And back then it was a big chunk of it. It was probably over 50, 60%. It was rare to be a type 2 diabetic.
So this is, the result is that's based on just our diets and our lifestyles. Is that right?
Yeah, it's essentially type 2 diabetes is essentially a lifestyle disorder. And type 1 diabetes is the absence of insulin. Type 2 diabetes is insulin resistance with too much insulin. And so it makes you wonder, you've got type 2 diabetics that have too much insulin, and we're giving them more insulin. We're trying to override their receptors. And so we're excessively giving them insulin to force glucose out of the bloodstream. And insulin is a growth hormone. So every time I give somebody insulin, I'm giving them growth hormone. And anytime you hear the word insulin, replace it with growth hormone. And I'll give you a classic example. You take a type 1 diabetic and they're newly diagnosed, you'll find out that they're really skinny. In fact, they can't keep weight on. That's one of the diagnostic elements, is that they have high glucose and they have failure to thrive, and they're really skinny, and they don't have any subcutaneous fat, and they don't have any liver fat. You put them on insulin, and all of a sudden they start to thrive, they start to grow, and then they start to accumulate fat. And they accumulate fat in their liver, and they accumulate fat in their subcutaneous space. And in fact, if you inject insulin in your subcutaneous space, you'll get lipodystrophy. You'll get large accumulated globs of fat wherever you inject insulin. That's why you have to rotate your insulin injection sites. So it's a growth hormone. Type 2 diabetics, however, have too much insulin in the first place. And so you're overriding them, making them get even bigger. And so as you give type 2 diabetics more insulin, they get bigger and bigger and bigger. And they store more and more of any consumed sugar as a fat. And so they look at themselves going, well, I'm eating practically nothing. And I'm eating like 20 grams or 50 grams of carbohydrate. And I'm taking this insulin, but I keep getting fatter. Why is it that I keep getting fatter? It's the signaling molecule of insulin that's a fat storage hormone that's causing them to gain fat preferentially. And they lose protein mass and they lose other things and convert to fat mass storage.
So the insulin is just,
it's a growth hormone.
Yeah, and it's just me, and it's having like because a big problem with diabetes is obesity too. So you're just
getting worse,
compounding the problem, I guess.
Yeah.
But when you say reversing diabetes, does that mean like cure type 2 diabetes?
Yeah, I mean, if you are no longer insulin resistant, you cure insulin type 2 diabetes. If you no longer are insulin resistant, you have normal metabolism. I have many patients, I mean, they come into me, they're 450 pounds, and 2 years later, their ideal body weight, and, they're down to 150 to 185 pounds, and they have normal hemoglobin A1C, and they have normal glucose tolerance tests, and they have normal glucagon function. They're cured. They're not going to go back to type 2 diabetes unless they overeat. And they have to overeat carbohydrates to do that. And so what you have to do is you can cure type 2 diabetes, but only within the context of fixing their receptors, which takes time. It's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. There's no magic cure that's going to happen in 30 days or 60 days. It's a complex issue. It's not just the carbohydrate. So, that's what I've been harping on is, don't eat sugar, don't eat sugar, don't eat sugar. It's not just the carbohydrate though. It's also the fatty acid structure of the lipid membrane in the cells. And what I mean by that is that you have to imagine that your cells are pools of lipids. Their surface, their wall is made of fat. And inside those fat walls, there are receptors. Those receptors are things like insulin receptors. Those receptors are things like epinephrine receptors and dopamine receptors and serotonin receptors. Everything that you can imagine that the cell needs information for comes into the cell through either a channel or a receptor. But if I take the wall and I make it too sticky, it may close down the receptor, it may close down the channel, and it makes the cell rigid. I can do that by giving somebody too much vegetable oil. If I give them a bunch of omega-6 fatty acid, which we do,
Hmm.
because that's what the standard American diet is. We used to have maybe a 3-to-1 ratio of omega-6, which is vegetable oil kind of oil, to omega-3, which is fish oil. Right now, the average U.S. person eats about 14-to-1. Um, the higher your omega-6 ratio, the more rigid your cell wall. The higher your omega-6 ratio, the more neuroinflammatory you are.
And this is something
And
that would be used in like restaurants too, if you're eating out a lot.
it depends on the restaurant. So I used
Vegetable,
to own
right?
restaurants, and I had to sell my restaurants because I was one of the goofballs that didn't want to serve people omega-6s. I wanted to serve them omega-3s, and I wanted to serve them saturated fat,
How
which was
dare you?
healthier. I know, which was healthier. And the problem is it's too expensive. And so you couldn't make enough money when you compete with the big chains. And so I got out of the restaurant business because I couldn't make it competitive. But when I cook for myself, I'm very careful what fats I allow into my body.
So yeah, what do you a daily meal plan that you have?
Okay, so I'll go back to the
Because
model.
you look like you're in shape and everything. Like so, I don't
I'm
know if they.
56 years old, 55, and I literally probably work out 15 minutes a day, 4 or 5 days a week. I spend most of my time when I'm in the gym thinking and listening to podcasts, and then I'll do one exercise to failure, and that's it. Or I'll do, one or two things, and it doesn't take much. I use Ben Bonoci's approach, which is to go very, very slow and fatigue through isotonic forces. And so I don't need a lot of weight. I just go really, really slow, and it depletes the glycogen in the muscle, which then gives me room to be able to eat. It depletes my glycogen reserve. So my meal plan is typically to allow my body to burn through its glycogen reserve. So I try to limit my feed cycle to a few hours a day, maybe 6 hours of the day. Ideally, if sometimes I forget to eat, so I might forget a day. I'm not somebody that believes that people should eat breakfast. People always say that breakfast is the best meal of the day. It's your best meal. To me, and that actually came about. That's a marketing slogan that came about in the 1940s.
Of course,
It
it
has
is.
nothing. It has nothing to do with science.
Everything's about the dollar.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you're trying to sell things, that's what it should be about. But if you're trying to be healthy,
You gotta look
you should
beyond.
examine their motivation.
Right.
And so if you eat breakfast, you're more likely to eat every 2 to 3 hours for the rest of the day. And so you'll end up eating, the average American has about 6 to 8 meals a day. And the reason why is they lack satiety. Satiety is a signal that tells you stop eating. Why do I need to eat? I'm full. But if I eat multiple small meals a day, I never deplete my glycogen. I constantly keep a high insulin level, and I never achieve satiety. And so,
This is like intermittent fasting.
yeah, so what I do is I do time restricted or intermittent fasting to minimize the excursion of insulin. And then if I do it that way, I'm actually quite full. And I don't really count calories. I don't do any of that stuff. I don't believe that you need to. Your body will have appropriate signaling mechanisms. Your signaling mechanism is called leptin. And leptin is a very potent cytokine also. And so just like you have insulin resistance, you can become leptin resistant, which then if you think about that for a second, and I told you that it's a very potent cytokine, then you realize why all of these diabetics are getting into complications from COVID. COVID-19 is not a bad virus. It's the bad virus in the wrong person. It's not the virus, it's the host. It's the person that has a cytokine storm that pre-exists, and then you throw this virus on top of it, and they get inflammation through their whole body, and then their lungs fill up with garbage, and they end up with complications. So it's this leptin resistance that's underlying, which is like insulin resistance. Leptin is your fullness hormone. When you constantly eat, you become resistant to leptin. Your body doesn't know it's full.
And how does that stage off something like the COVID virus
It doesn't stage it off.
or
Basically,
minimize?
yeah. So it's the virus itself just if interacts with your body.
That's what a virus
It,
is, right? It just
yeah,
it attaches to a host.
yeah. It attaches. Well, it attaches to your cells, and it attaches to a receptor. And in this particular case, it's called the ACE2 receptor. Um, and it connects to this receptor, and then it gets into the cell. It hijacks the cellular metabolism and replicates itself so that it can spread to other organisms. Well, in this particular case, your body, if you have high leptin, leptin is a potent cytokine. Cytokines are inflammatory mediators. And if you have a lot of these inflammatory mediators floating around, you'll get a ton of macrophage migration. You'll get a ton of T cell migration. And it'll cause tremendous complications for you because your lungs will fill up with white blood cells and then you can't breathe. It creates an inability.
Is that what's happening with people's lungs? It's filling till they're filling up with too many white blood cells.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
I didn't
know.
Yeah, that's so the reason why their oxygenation is going down is that the basement membrane and the alveoli have become separated. And as they separate, because they're filled with inflammatory cytokines and they're filled with white blood cells, you can't breathe. You can physically breathe, but you can't transmit oxygen across from your lungs into your bloodstream. You become hypoxic, and then you go into multi-system organ failure. Your organs start to shut down, and then you die. And so the solution is not necessarily pump you full of more oxygen. The solution is turn off the inflammatory cascade. And so a lot of the drug therapy that we're headed towards for COVID will be an inflammatory cascade mediator. We'll figure out ways to turn off that inflammatory cascade. And so there's a whole host of drugs that we're experimenting with right now that turn off that inflammation, including exosomes and all kinds of other cool substances that allow the inflammation to turn off.
Do you have any thoughts on vitamin D?
Yeah, vitamin D is not a vitamin. Vitamin D it's a hormone. No. Everybody says it's vitamin D. Vitamin D is more akin to a hormone. It's actually, if you look at it, it's a steroidal structure. It looks more like almost, I would tell you that vitamin D looks closer to a testosterone molecule than anything else. Vitamin D is a surrogate marker. You have low vitamin D because you're not in the sun. You have low vitamin D because you're not producing natural hormones. Vitamin D is a marker that you're doing something wrong. And if you have low vitamin D, it's just a marker that you have a bad diet. And so if you can get normal vitamin D if you're in the sun and you have a good diet. So it just happens to be a marker. I think these patients, the vast majority of them are vitamin D deficient. And they're vitamin D deficient because it's a marker of other bad things. It's not necessarily vitamin D itself that's causing the problem. It's just a marker of metabolic dysfunction.
So you wouldn't necessarily recommend a supplement?
Well, we give all of our patients vitamin D supplementation initially because it makes their entire chemistry work better. I think it's a reasonable approach, but the long-term solution is change your diet so that you can naturally produce the vitamin D and then get in the sun. You need that sunlight.
Part of the diet is getting into the sun, like the whole lifestyle.
Part of the diet's yeah.
Is there any merit to, like, you see erythritol, is that what it's called? The natural sweeteners that they say.
Erythritol.
Is that, I've been pronouncing it wrong for years.
Erythritol. Yeah.
And all those low glycemic index sweeteners, do those have any benefit, or is that a marketing thing as well?
So there are a couple of studies that have come out about this. Individuals who use sweeteners, artificial sweeteners, so that is 0 calorie but sweet on your tongue, are at much higher rate of type 2 diabetes. And the reason why is because when that sweetness touches your tongue, your body thinks, I'm about to get a sugar load. And so you start to pulse out insulin. So you pulse out a bunch of insulin, and there's no glucose coming into your system. So as you pulse out that insulin, whatever floating glucose you have gets pushed into a fat reserve because your body's anticipating a large sugar rush. It gets pushed into the fat reserves, and then you're temporarily hypoglycemic, and then you end up eating food and you end up storing fat. The more fat you've stored in your liver, the more insulin resistant you become, and it's a problem for you. So that's why people that take artificial sugars end up more likely to be diabetic than patients that don't take artificial sugars.
That sucks.
Given the choice, I would tell you, just if you're going to have an artificial sugar, I'd rather just have you have regular sugar. I mean, it's much safer for you, and your body actually knows how to handle regular sugar. It does not know how to handle high fructose corn syrup. Because you have to realize table sugar is one molecule of glucose and one molecule of fructose. It's a 50-50 mix. So table sugar is sucrose, which is one molecule of glucose and one molecule of fructose. Your body knows how to handle that. It takes the fructose and it uses it through the liver, and it quickly metabolizes it, and the glucose it will convert relatively quickly to fat store. But what's interesting is when fructose gets into your brain versus glucose in your brain, fructose is hyper addictive. Glucose is not. Glucose activates the serotonin system, and fructose activates the dopaminergic system. So let's play a game. If I was a big food manufacturer and I wanted to addict people to food, and I know that the dopaminergic system is the system that causes addiction, what would I do? I would give them more fructose. So high fructose corn syrup is typically considered a 55% fructose, 45% glucose. That's what high fructose corn syrup is. But what's in our sodas? Our sodas are almost 58 to 60% fructose. So they spend extra money converting high fructose corn syrup to high fructose corn syrup, and they don't have to tell anybody this, because the high fructose corn syrup is even more addictive than the regular fructose. And so it's a game. It's a machination, and it's a manipulation of our dopaminergic systems.
So if you're going to have something sweet,
I prefer that you not have anything sweet, because
what about I'm sorry, real quick.
Go ahead.
I heard a post after a workout, it could be beneficial to restore your glycogen deficiency, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it is beneficial to restore it, but why not just have your body restore it anyway? Why not have your fat converted to glucose and glycogen? Why not pull it out of your fat reserves?
So you wouldn't recommend, like, after a workout to have like bananas and strawberries in a protein
Not at all.
shake?
No, I think that's
I've been doing it wrong.
Nearly worthless. And that, it's, and I'm not trying to critique anybody, but from a physiologic standpoint,
we need to know, because, and you just said these things about these no calorie sweeteners too. It's important because you go to the vitamin shop or you go to a supermarket and you go down the healthy aisle and you see something that says 2 grams net carbs, but then it's loaded with all these other sweeteners.
Right. I mean, if you're going to have, my feeling is, if you're going to cause an insulin excursion, you might as well make it worth your while. So if you're going to do that, have food for the insulin to do something with. So I would prefer that you not have artificial sweeteners. If you're going to have an insulin excursion and you're really looking at growing your muscle mass, which is what growth hormone does, then it makes sense that you might want to do that. Now, I'm not talking about biohacking somebody that is, trying to get down to 8% body fat and trying to be looking as a fitness model. That's a whole different biohacking system. And I would have a totally different approach for them. I'm talking about the average human being eating the standard American diet, who only 12% of them are biologically healthy in the United States. That means 88% of them are metabolically dysfunctional.
We
Only
have, so
12%. Only 12% of the average American population has a normal metabolism now. 88% does not. Our pre-diabetes rate is about between 40 to 60% of average Americans. And the vast majority of them don't know that they're pre-diabetic.
what qualifies somebody as being pre-diabetic? Is that necessarily just a blood sugar content?
Blood sugar is it's a lagging indicator. By the time that you have sustained high blood sugars, you have a problem already. So the correct indicator is insulin, fructosamine, blood sugar, and hemoglobin A1C. If you look at those four things in context, then you can get to a diagnosis relatively early. But by the time that you have a sustained high glucose level fasting, you're probably well on your way to being fully diabetic. A hemoglobin A1C greater than 5.7 is considered pre-diabetic. A hemoglobin A1C greater than 6.4 is considered diabetic. But what you want to do is you want to capture patients before they become diabetic, and you want to capture them while they're pre-diabetic between 5.7 and 6.4 and reverse them. And what the sensitivity in that is to look at their insulin level. It's to look at their insulin production. And what you'll find is they have very high insulin production, and they'll maintain high insulin production until they get to beta cell fatigue in the pancreas. When their pancreas gives out, then their glucose suddenly starts to rise quickly. And that's when they get polyuria. That's when they start peeing all the time. As you start to have nocturnal polyuria, peeing all the time in the middle of the night, you're pretty far along. And so that's a different situation. And by then, your primary care, your doctor will be recommending that you go on to insulin. But you've already been pre-diabetic for years by then. And so it's harder to reverse by then. It's not irreversible, it's just harder.
Let's flip it and say somebody's trying to gain weight.
Okay.
How would you just more of a ketogenic diet, just higher calories?
It depends on what you're trying to do. I mean, if you're trying to gain muscle mass,
right?
That's one thing. And really what you want to figure out is what's their underlying issue? Why is it that they're not gaining muscle mass? Because most humans will gain muscle mass if you stress their muscles. If you stress somebody's muscles, it causes muscle degradation, and then it causes a release of a whole host of growth hormones, which will then cause reformation of muscle. So you want to understand why they're not gaining it in the first place. That's, understand the physiology first. Then if you concluded that you want to have them gain muscle mass and you can do it with growth hormones, then there's a whole host of ways to do it. And so some of the things that I've done for my patients is I use hormetic responses. Hormetic responses are things that injure your body but don't kill you. And I know that sounds strange, but a sauna is a hormetic response. If you get into the sauna 10 or 15 minutes, it causes a release of something called heat shock protein 9.
Yes. If anybody's listening to Joe Rogan.
Okay, so it will release heat shock protein 9. Same thing with getting into a cold bath. Same thing with any other stressor. It'll cause a release of growth hormone. And you can modulate that growth hormone to go high after you eat. And then most of what you consume, the amino acids, are driven into muscle, and the fat is driven in to help you bulk up in size. And that can happen pretty quickly. That's why people use milk post-workout.
Whole milk?
Because it has whole milk. They use milk because it has a ton of growth hormone in it. We have a ton of growth hormone in milk. Milk is not necessary for adult mammals. It's only necessary for small mammals growing quickly because it's a growth hormone. It's very potent. If you give an adult mammal growth hormone from milk, they get big, but they're not going to get taller. They get wider. They'll initially gain some muscle mass, and then Eventually, after they've gained sufficient muscle mass, it'll start to change over and they'll get real pudgy. And then they'll start to gain fat mass, and then they'll become diabetic as they become insulin resistant, because the fat drives them to insulin resistance.
So you would recommend whole milk for somebody?
Yeah, I mean,
After
if somebody, yeah, if somebody really wants, if they're really desperate to gain, that you're biohacking at that point.
Right.
And
Okay.
that's not the regular human being. That's somebody that really
Of course.
wants to gain 40 pounds of muscle. And that's a physique model, or that's somebody that really is looking for a particular gain. Yeah, it's performance enhancing. And there are very subtle ways to do that. There's also a whole host of peptides that you could look at, somorelin and a few other things that you can use. There are other compounds, but that's not the average. That's not what the average patient needs. The average patient, is overweight. The
Mm-hmm.
average patient can't walk up 3 flights of stairs, and so that's a different character.
And so I don't think we went through this before, but I think we brought it up. But your average meal plan. And I think you
Oh,
said skip
so I
breakfast.
try to I skip breakfast. I usually eat around 11:30. I'll tell you what I eat, and I used to be a vegetarian, and I own a barbecue restaurant after that. So
I was going to ask you too about these plant-based things and these carnivore diets. There's a lot of
yeah. So yeah, let's talk about that. And so it's my opinion, and it's not just mine. It's actually well founded. A vegan diet is not a sustainable diet. It's a absorption diet. It's a nutrient deficiency diet. It will make you lose a ton of weight. It will make you lose weight very, very quickly because you're not absorbing all of your nutrients and it's not bioavailable. And so you may be eating a ton of food and you may be feeling full because you have a distended abdomen, you have a distended stomach, but you're not getting nutrient dense.
So you're
And over
unhealthy.
time,
You're just
yeah,
look different.
you're
Unhealthy.
skinny. You look different. You're skinny, and if you look at those patients, many of them overconsume carbohydrates, and then they become pre-diabetic because they're constantly insulin excursioning. And the more frequency of insulin that you have that's pumping out, and the higher that insulin level is, that's more likely that you're going to become pre-diabetic or diabetic. But you will certainly get skinny. There's no doubt about that. If you are running a pure vegan diet, you will get skinnier. And if you want to have a cleanse, I have no problem with it. Now, that's different than a carnivore diet. A carnivore diet is you're eating a lot of saturated fat, you're eating protein, and most people that do carnivore diet will not eat any vegetables. Most of the patients that end up on carnivore diet typically have dietary issues with oxalates and phytates, and they have issues with vegetable products. And you would think to yourself, well, how could you possibly have an issue with a vegetable product? And I'll bring you to the analogy of if I'm a proto-human, if I'm a caveman human, and I look off in the distance and there's this giant mastodon, I'm going to hunt it, I'm going to kill it, and I'm going to be in a group. The mastodon is going to do one of two things when I approach it. It's going to either fight or it's going to flight.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to either run away or it's going to fight me. And those are the two options that it has. If I, on the other hand, am a vegan or vegetarian and I approach this beautiful bush that I want to eat, what can it do? It can sit there and I can eat it. It doesn't have a defense mechanism of fight or flight. What's its defense mechanism? Its defense mechanism is biotoxins. They're chemical compounds that are highly toxic that make me puke and prevent me from reproducing. And
Great
it makes me
endorsement.
feel like shit.
Great
Yeah, it makes me feel like shit. So you have two different pathways. One is I use biotoxicology to stop you from eating me. And the other way is that I'm a human and I'm a heterotroph and I can absorb all of the nutrients in this other body, but the other body runs away from it, or tries to stab me with its tusks. And so both ways I get nutrition. One way I'm getting a toxin, and the other way I have to fight for it.
So you'd want the
And
one that you have to fight for.
yeah, I want the one that I have to fight for, because I know that I can absorb nearly everything in that in that other organism, and I can get all of the compounds that I need. So I am predominantly, I would say 85% carnivorous. I
Oh
still like,
shit!
and so I still will occasionally eat some vegetable stuff, just because I like the texture in my mouth. And but I'm
Something different.
predominantly, I'm predominantly 85% carnivore. And so I basically eat twice a day, maybe once a day sometimes. And I like grapes in the form of wine, and so that's my vegetable. You know, I like having
It's a
wine every
vegetable.
once in a while.
This
Yeah,
is
I
wine.
mean yeah, it's my
This,
carbohydrate and my vegetable. But I will still eat a salad every once in a while. I mean, sometimes you want to eat one and it tastes good. It doesn't mean it's healthy for me. And a lot of my patients have severe pain, so they can't tolerate oxalates, they can't tolerate nightshades, they can't tolerate phytates. A
and
lot of them have lupus.
what are those things? It's just
Those are biochemical defense mechanisms of
that's the
plants.
plants. Okay.
That's in plants. And Stephen Gundry has a beautiful book on this, where he talks about biodefense mechanisms of plants and the issues associated with plant toxicology.
Okay. Um. So what do you have, like steak and eggs?
Um,
I don't know what did you have a hard out?
I'm sorry.
You have a hard out time?
No. I give you a little bit more time. It's not a problem for me. So yeah, I typically will eat. I'll eat hamburger meat and eggs for lunch, and then if I'm still hungry at dinner, I'll have some other form of protein with some fat. It doesn't really matter to me.
Let me.
Um,
I have to ask. The hamburger meat is
yeah,
the difference with grass fed and different types of meat and
there is, but I think it's really based upon your ability to obtain it. I would tell you the one difference that I think is substantive. I don't think that grass-fed meat is necessarily healthier. In fact, I think that grass-fed meat doesn't taste as good. The reason why is because it's usually leaner.
Mhm.
And that leanness, the lack of fat, is the one thing that drives the lack of taste. And it may taste more metallic for some people. And I personally prefer a blend that's about 85% meat and 15% fat. I think a little higher fat content is appropriate. And because I want to maintain my saturated fats as best as I can, and I want to be able to naturally produce hormones. And so, that's how I approach it. Everybody's different. I eat eggs. I don't have any issue with eggs. I eat cheese. I don't have any issue with cheese. Usually I get so full that I find it difficult to eat dinner. And I really look at dinner as a socialization time. And so I'll eat some food, but I don't necessarily need to eat the food. I usually find that if I've eaten a decent lunch, a lot of times I'll just skip dinner because I'm just not hungry. Um, but it all depends on what else I'm doing. My schedule is I get up about 3:30 in the morning.
Yeah, me
And
too.
yeah, and
Just
so
kidding.
it's you get to do all kinds of cool stuff, and
Mhm.
I'm falling asleep tired by 9 or 10, and I'm exhausted, and I sleep solid. I don't have any issues with sleep disturbance, and I wake up refreshed. And if I've had about 7+ hours of sleep, I'm ecstatic, um, and for me that's really ideal. And I prefer, if I could, I would probably be one meal a day. I would want it to be dinner so I could socialize, but that doesn't always work out. And so my meal sometimes is earlier, and then I just socialize for dinner. Um,
Did were when you started to adapt to that type of eating schedule and that type of lifestyle, how long did it take for your body to really adjust to it? Because I'm sure. I mean, I
it
don't
takes
know.
cycles. It doesn't happen right away, and you shouldn't make it. It takes cycles. The easiest thing to do is to skip breakfast. Once you start skipping breakfast, everything else is easier. So that's step one. That's the easiest meal for most people to skip. Skip your breakfast and then eat later. And then start to eat more things that are more satiating. And satiating means fat and protein. Things that are not satiating are carbohydrates. So as you increase the amount of fat and protein and you eliminate the carbohydrate, you're going to find out that you don't need to eat as much. You're going to find out that you don't need to eat as frequently. I'm a person of routines because I don't want to have a lot of decisions. So I own 20 of the same shirt, 20 of the same pair of pants, 20 of the same pair of shorts. I have 2 pairs of shoes and that's it. And I'm very, I don't want to have a lot of decisions. So I eat the same thing practically every day for lunch. And then I might have some decisional choices for dinner. I might have,
What do you say, the hamburger?
yeah, it might be hamburger, might be steak, might be some other form of protein. And then it might be a different kind of saturated fat. I might throw some bacon on there. Maybe once a month, I'll have half a baked potato because I really want a half a baked potato.
You said once a month?
Yeah, maybe once a month I'll have a half a baked potato and load it up with a bunch of butter and eat that. And usually it's cooled. And so as long as it's cooled, I'm not going to absorb all the carbohydrate. What you want to avoid is the consumption of fat plus carbohydrate at the same time. If you can avoid fat and carbohydrate at the same time, it'll prevent you from gaining weight. If you can gaining fat mass, but if you eat carbohydrate and fat at the same time, you will gain fat mass, and it's just the way how your body works. It's that combination of insulin excursion in the presence of fat consumption that causes your problem. And that's, by the way, that's another thing with veganism. Why they get skinny is they're not eating much fat, but they're eating a lot of carbohydrate. You would think that they'd be overweight, but they're getting pre-diabetic, but they're getting skinny at the same time because it's malabsorption. That's why carnivore works, because you're not eating sugar, but you're eating a lot of fat and protein. And all diets work better than our standard diet, practically speaking.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something everybody can agree on. You said, but man, I had a thought. I just lost my thought. Just brain fog. Is there any type of supplements you would recommend? Do you take anything to complement? Oh, that's what I wanted to ask you. I'm sorry. So I had that written down, but fiber.
So fiber is a very interesting concept. There's all kinds of recommendations for fiber, but they're not based on science. They're completely garbage. Okay. There is no necessity for human beings to consume fiber. Your body, the vast bulk of what you shit out is bacteria. It's not fiber. It's non-digested material and bacteria. Probably over 90% is bacteria. You don't necessarily need fiber. Certainly fiber feeds some of your microbiome, and it feeds and allows a propulsion effect to occur, but there's no necessity for fiber. We've always said, oh, take this amount to get the healthy fiber that you need, and it might reduce your risk of colon cancer. There's never been a study that actually showed that. That's all kind of, one person telling another person that, oh, this would work. But there's no fundamental basis for this. There's some good reviews on fiber studies, and there's no real science behind consuming any fiber. So fiber will certainly reduce your glucose excursions because it will buffer the glucose absorption if you're eating carbohydrates. But there's no necessity for fiber in anything. So I'll just dispel some myths that people have. People have the myth, oh, you should have so many servings of this beautiful colored fruit, and you need fruit to be healthy. The reason why these beautifully colored fruits are felt to be antioxidants is that the beautifully colored fruits have phenolic compounds in them. That's what gives them their color. And they actually work on the inner surface of the mitochondria.
What are phenolic compounds are?
They're a chemical compound.
Okay.
that are phenols. They're rings. They're aromatic rings, and that also gives them their color. And that's why people talk about multicolored fruits being better for you, and these are healthy, and you should have so many servings. Um, the reason why they're believed to be anti-inflammatory is because they notice that the reactive oxidase synthesis system, the ROS system out of the mitochondria, is geared up once you have these fruits. The reason why is these phenolic compounds are toxic for the mitochondria, and the mitochondria is trying to protect itself, and the biogenic amines in there are trying to get away from these phenolic compounds. And so there's an ROS feedback loop that's occurring. So I really look at fruits as dessert. If you want to have a dessert and you're going to have a spectacular dessert, then go have a fruit. Um, the other thing with fruits is that people assume that the fruits that we have today is the fruits that we had in 1975, which is the fruits that we had in 1925, which is the fruits that we had in the 1800s. It's simply not true. If you take grapes and you put them in a glass and you smush them down, the current grape would have as much, and you poured out the grape juice. So now it's same a grape, a glass full of grapes smushed down, you get a certain amount of juice, which is about 65 to 70% of it. The amount of sugar in that 65% volume is greater than the amount of sugar that would be in a soda of equivalent volume, because our grapes have been re-engineered to be much sweeter. We have a much higher density of sugar in there, and they've been re-engineered to be sweeter for the current palate. Most of our, if you go to the grocery store and you look at the produce aisles, you'll notice all these amazing produce, and they all look so beautiful and perfect, and these broccoli heads and cauliflower. That's not what these vegetables look like 100 years ago. This is made up. They've been bioengineered. They've been engineered over the last 5,000 years since we've had the agrarian revolution. But over the last 150 years, we've really modified them quite a bit. And they're not the same fruit, and they're not the same vegetable that we used to have, that our biologic systems are used to.
So when you see something that says non-GMO,
that doesn't mean anything. Just because it's not genetically modified by a gene insertion doesn't mean that they didn't use Mendelian genetics to modify it over time and change its infrastructure. I mean, if you so let's say that I have a large field of a new plant that I just discovered, and I look at that field and there's one beautiful plant in there, and I go, God, that looks tasty. And it tastes like shit, but it looks beautiful. And then I have this other field that has the same plant, but one of them tastes really good and it's really ugly. And I pair those two together, and now I've got a beautiful plant that tastes pretty good. And then I keep hybriding those together and keep hybriding them together. Over a couple of generations, I'll end up with this amazing looking plant that also tastes amazingly good. That's not necessarily perfectly healthy for me. Just because it looks good and just because it tastes good doesn't mean that my biology knows how to handle it, because I generated it in 5 or 6 generations. You know, our human history goes back millions of years. Our farming revolution is not that old. And our industrial revolution is not that old. And our vegetable oil revolution is only from 1975, 1978. In fact, we weren't even really using vegetable oil till Crisco came out in the 1910, 1920 region, 1930. I mean, we didn't have solid vegetable oil fats until they figured out how to hydrogenate fat, how to hydrogenate omega-6s. And so that was a new phenomenon. The whole thing of Crisco is about selling large amounts of purified vegetable oil that's subsidized to housewives. They came out with cookbooks and made people feel more modern by selling them these modern Crisco cookbooks, and got people away from using lard, because that was they talked about how ugly of the processing plants were for lard manufacturing.
So do you cook with you cook with like butter, olive oil?
Yeah, butter, olive oil, lard. I have not bought, even in my restaurants, we stopped buying all vegetable oil years ago, and we don't use any vegetable oil anywhere. And you can actually do something. It's a blood test. It's called an omega check. And it'll tell you exactly how much oil to omega-3 that you have as a ratio. You can also do an omega-6 to 3 ratio test, which is separate than an omega check. And it'll give you your isotypes. So you can figure out what you're actually eating.
These are lab tests?
These are blood tests. It's a quick blood test. And it's not complicated. Once you figure out those isomers, and once you figure out what's going on with which kind of oil that you have, then you can make some informed decisions to how to change it.
Okay, so let me ask. So, do you take any multivitamin or anything like that?
I don't take any multivitamin. The only so I don't love fish. I'm not somebody that goes out and loves. I like sushi, but I'm locked in the Midwest. I'm in St. Louis, and we don't really get amazing sushi here. We can, but it gets super, super expensive. So when I'm on the coast, I eat sushi, and I'll devour sushi. But in the Midwest, I don't get good sushi, and I need more omega-3s. So I personally use krill oil. Krill oil is like fish oil, but it has an interesting compound in it. It has a terpene called astaxanthin in it, and astaxanthin is a very potent terpene that's also a potent anti-inflammatory. And it's the one that I have my patients use. I don't care which one they use as long as it's biologically stable and appropriately harvested.
You're talking about the brand?
I don't care what brand they use as long as it doesn't have mercury in it and it's been tested. But what I want them to use is krill oil instead of fish oil. And the reason why is because of that astaxanthin. So I typically take about 4 to 6 grams of that a day. And other than that, my only other real supplement is caffeine.
Coffee?
Coffee or black tea or maca or whatever. Yeah, exactly. And then the other thing that, I'll supplement with magnesium every once in a while because I get into the sauna a lot and I do sweat a lot. And so my electrolytes do shift, and I test myself. I'm actually one of these goofballs that will do a blood test on myself before and after getting into the sauna. I experiment on myself all the time.
So what have you learned doing that?
Well, I managed to put myself into atrial fib because my potassium dropped so quickly one time. And I actually put myself almost into a bigeminy rhythm. It was very potentially dangerous because I was in the sauna too long. I was trying to see how much potassium was coming out of me, and I was measuring the electrolytes in my sweat. And when I mean I was in too long, I was in there for like an hour because I was purposeful, and I was trying to see at what time and what my core temperature was. And so I was doing an experiment, and I ended up changing my cardiac rhythm. So I had to take a bunch of potassium to recover that. Humans can do dangerous, stupid things to themselves. And if you know too much, if you know too much, then sometimes you get more stupid. And so I did that, and it was a mistake. And I'll never do that again. So, but I do take some magnesium, and that's about it. I mean, I take krill oil. I take some caffeine as a supplemental performance enhancing drug. If I take caffeine, if I don't have time for coffee, like if I'm presenting at a conference or something, I'm not going to have time for coffee, then I'll take caffeine plus theanine. Theanine is a calming drug. If I have a period of time where I've really been pushing hard, and I won't take caffeine after 11 a.m. Because the half-life of caffeine is fairly long. And so if I have caffeine in the afternoon, I know that I'm going to have a sleep disturbance that night. But if I'm super jazzed up and I ended up working out late and my adrenaline is high, because most of the time I work out in the morning, but if I end up working out late, then I'll take a GABA supplement. GABA aminobutyric acid.
GABA is supposed to be helpful for anxiety too, correct?
It is. It's a potent anxiolytic. GABA and glycine are both potent anxiolytics, and they're the exact opposite of a neurotransmitter that causes NMDA activation, and that neurotransmitter is glutamate. So what I try to do is avoid things with glutamate in it, and I propose that I take more things with GABA. And so if I have GABA calms you down almost immediately and puts you to sleep in about 30 minutes. And so if I've had a particularly rough workout or particular thing that I've been keeping me awake or stuff, then I'll use that as a supplement. I don't take any serotonin. I don't take any melatonin. I'm on no medications. And I'm a minimalist, so I don't remember to take my krill oil every day, but because I'm taking 4 to 6 grams, I take it a couple times a week. I don't remember to take my magnesium. I might take that once or twice a week. I think that your body tells you what to crave. And so as long as you're eating whole, real food, you probably have everything in it that you really need. And as long as you're avoiding processed food, you're not getting fooled by the processed food. Because we've engineered this processed food to be hyper palatable, and it's nutritionally deficient and hyper palatable. It used to be if you were a wild human and you ran across something that was delicious, it was probably hyper palatable and nutritionally dense. But now we've re-engineered our foods.
It's no nutrients.
There's no nutrient in it. And so our taste bud says, hey, this is delicious. Let's eat more of these nachos, or let's eat more of these Doritos. There's actually a book called The Dorito Effect that describes this. And we've changed the food profile, and we've added things that stimulate our flavor profiles to make us eat more of garbage that has no nutritive value to us. You have to realize that omega-6s, which is vegetable oil, when they rot, we're hardwired to like them. If an omega-3 rots, it's horrible. It smells like you're in an STD clinic. It smells like you're sitting around with a bunch of dead fish.
Oh, okay. That's why some fish oils
smell like shit.
Don't take those.
Don't take those because they're rotted. Yeah.
Okay. Man, I'm very happy people like you exist to steer us through these the complexity, especially in today's world where there's so much information, and you could, like we've been saying, a common theme has been marketing. You get told all these things could be healthy, have your fiber, have this, have that. Net carbs is something that I saw a lot. But, you got to sift through the shit because people are still getting sick and having toxic reactions to all this stuff. We could start to, let me just ask one more thing. Is there any type of diet or food that you have studied or found to be beneficial to like somebody's mental health or like their anxiety or depression levels or anything like that? Then we could start to if you're good with it.
Yeah. There's a woman by the name of Ifland, Dr. Ifland, Ifland. She's an addiction psychologist. And there's a whole host of people that have specialized in this field. The vast majority of anxiety is driven through your gut health. Your primitive brain. So if you were a sea anemone, you don't have a cerebral cortex. In fact, you don't have a cortex. What you have is a gut, and that gut has a primitive nervous system. And that primitive nervous system drives most of the dopamine and serotonin in your body. And serotonin is what drives anxiety.
This is why people would say they have like a gut feeling about something.
Yeah, and it's real. And it's that transmission of information from your intestines through your vagus nerve up into your cognition, into your cortex. So you have all of this nerve tissue in your intestines, and it drives information through your vagus nerve and through hormones up into your brain where you perceive it. But that primitive brain is where most of your anxiety resides. And if you modify or modulate the neurotransmitters there, you can affect the neurotransmitters in the brain. The vast majority of anti-anxiety patients, if you change their diet, they're no longer anxious. I take patients all the time that have been on benzodiazepines for years. We wean them off and we change their diet, and they don't need the benzos. And so that's the key element, is to your body wasn't born with a Xanax deficiency. I mean, you weren't born that way. You acquired that Xanax deficiency because you're faced with all kinds of cataclysmic environmental things, which may be job related, stress related, family related, XYZ related, but they're maintained by your diet and those changes. If you look at most of the drugs that we use for these kind of issues, they don't really work that well. In fact, it's when you take people off the drugs that they get worse, but they're not that much better for a short period after a short period of time. So they lose their effectiveness over the first couple of months, and then it's worse when they come off because they have become habituated to it. The body quickly adapts to these changes and changes its neurotransmitters and changes the density of receptors. It upregulates and downregulates. This is why people that, if you give them low doses of narcotics, quickly upregulate the dosages of narcotics, because their neurotransmitters habituate to those. Their mu receptors habituate. And so you have to do dose escalation to get the same effect. Same thing with a lot of these other drugs that we use, a lot of the mood drugs. So I would prefer that we use dietary change to enhance mood rather than chemical drugs to enhance mood.
Beautiful. So, Doctor, can I go with Doctor G? Is that cool?
Dr. G is fine. Padda, it's fine. Either way.
If people want to follow you,
so
learn more about you,
I would recommend that they go to probably one of our websites. It's www.reversediabetes.md. And so it's not .com, it's .md. And there's a ton of video on there. We give away our protocols for free. I do $1.5 million to $2 million of free care a year. I work in the urban core. I work in the urban centers. I love doing what I do, and I like helping people. And so we do a lot of free care. All of our protocols are there. Every one of our presentations that we teach other physicians. So it's detailed information. So if somebody wants to dive deep, that's the place to go, because it has everything from what is GGT to, what is gamma glutamyl transferase and what does it mean to hazard ratios, all the way to, how does vitamin D work, or how do you get to glycogen depletion, or, why is it that cyanide kills you in 3 seconds? It has all of that information in there, and it's all on the video content. And that's the easiest way. And I always respond to any emails from there. We're not selling anything. So there's not a nickel of profit in this. If somebody can change their lives, then, we'll help them. And our goal is to change society and have people recognize the deficiencies that we've created. I personally have an MBA also, MBA in finance. And I used to be in hardcore on selling people products. And I think that's the wrong place to have been. It's what I'm trying to get away from. And I want people to be healthy. I want them to recognize the misinformation that we've been giving them and to make changes and do it in a responsible way. And I'm diet agnostic. Even though I make fun of vegans, I'm diet agnostic because I know that the vegans are doing the right thing for a period of time. But eventually, 3/4 of vegans are no longer vegans after a year. 75% of them don't want to maintain veganism. And the reason why is they become nutrient deficit. They lose their weight, just like somebody with bariatric surgery. You create artificial nutrient deficiency by giving somebody bariatric surgery, by doing a bypass or a sleeve. And then they start to have the other side. Then they start getting the complications of nutritional deficiency. They start to lose their cartilage. They start to lose their teeth. They start to lose their muscle mass. It's the same thing with any strict diet. And so you really have to listen to your body as in terms of what it needs at that moment, and not let your body get fooled by the marketing message. And that marketing message can come in a variety of ways: by color, by smell, by texture, by flavor. And these flavor engineers are addiction masters. They're masters of the addiction field. When we went away from cigarette manufacturing in the United States, as cigarettes is the most addictive substance we had, a lot of those addiction specialists from the cigarette world went to the food world. And now they're moving slowly over to the marijuana world. And so we're going to have hyper addictive marijuana strains very shortly.
And that's been the biggest argument that the establishment has had against marijuana.
Yeah, we believe that it's non-addictive in its natural form.
Right.
And by the way, narcotics from the opium poppy are also non-addictive in its natural state. It's only when you modify it, because when you produce opiate, you produce an equal amount of anti-opiate, which is called naloxone. And we used to throw naloxone away because it was a garbage drug. And we used to take the opiate, the morphine, and sell that. And we threw away the naloxone until we had this fentanyl epidemic. And now we're selling naloxone at $300 a pop and morphine at 27 cents a pop, because we need the naloxone to combat the heroin. And so it's just a marketing message at that very moment in time. And so my preference is that, you know, we recognize that we're being marketed to, and then recognize what to do with that marketing message.
Man, Doc, thank you so much. So everybody take your krill oil, predominantly carnivore.
Yeah.
Cold showers.
Cold showers are awesome.
Cold showers are awesome.
I prefer hot steam though, because I'm a big wimp when it gets too cold.
But yeah, in the case somebody can't get to a sauna,
yeah,
you at least get to put your shower on cold.
Yeah.
Put some ice in the tub, maybe.
Exactly.
I don't know. Depends how crazy you want to get, or how not crazy you want to get. And I'm gonna put you on the spot right now. Would you come back on?
Sure, absolutely.
Because I feel like, you know, I'm gonna look personally to start changing my diet. I think it could be an interesting discussion to see how I'm changing. Yeah. And, you know,
the one area that people never really ask me about that I wish people would is about addiction. Okay. And we're getting addiction wrong. We are completely misinformed about addiction, and that is an area that needs reformation.
When you say addiction, you mean addiction to?
Well, addiction to narcotics.
Narcotics, okay.
Yeah, we're getting that wrong. We're misunderstanding what addiction is, and we're misunderstanding fundamentally how to fix it. And that's why our addiction rates are going so high. And so that's something, you know, if we come back, that's, you know, I'd love to talk about addiction, because I think that that's a fundamental problem in an advanced society that we need to figure out quickly. That's going to be a big problem for us. And I know that people will go both ways and go, oh, you know, it's a psychological problem. No, it's a morality problem. No, it's a this problem. It's a that problem. None of that's true. Addiction is a whole different pathway. And once you recognize what it truly is, it's actually pretty easy to treat. It's not difficult to treat, but you have to recognize what it is. And then you have to take the financial incentive out of it to treat it. And if you can do that, we don't really have an addiction problem anymore.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think that'd be fascinating.
Yeah.
And if people, so reverse diabetes at MD.
Yep.
And take it from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got 38 websites, but that's the one that if you're trying to connect to me and you're interested in this field, that's the field that I would go to, reversediabetes.md.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Doc.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. All right, bye-bye.